Thank you. Thank you very much. And I want to just thank the Sobrato Foundation for hosting these events, and Alexa for helping to organize, and her team. You guys have been incredibly terrific to work with. You've made this very, very easy. And I think it's great to see local funders investing in capacity building, right? And helping build the skills of all of you in this room to do your work and do it more effectively. So I'm honored to be here today. I'm not going to ask Erin and Vincent to come up yet, but let me just say a couple words by way of introduction about them, and then we're going to find out who else is in the room in the audience today. This is going to be a very interactive session, so we're going to be doing some polling throughout. I assume a number of you, raise your hand if you've been to one of these sessions before and used the text polling function. Okay, so we're going to be doing some of that as well, and we're going to, in addition to having what we hope will be a lively and engaging dialogue with Erin and Vincent, we will also be making lots of time for your questions and conversation throughout, and sort of polling you to see where your thoughts are on these issues of leadership and culture. Let me just say a couple words of introduction by way of Erin and Vincent, and you guys can stay in your seats for just a couple more minutes. But Erin Ganju, the bios are on your seats, but Erin Ganju is the CEO and co-founder of Room to Read, which is a global organization working in 10 countries to work on girls' literacy and education. If any of you read the book, Leaving Microsoft to Change the World, that was written by John Wood, her co-founder. Erin has really been his partner all along, helping build this amazing organization with 900 employees, and I believe their budget is now over $40 million. So what's interesting, I think, about the speakers we have here today is they represent two very different kinds of organizations. So Erin and Room to Read really started as one of the very first Draper Richards Kaplan grantees as a social entrepreneurial model around building libraries and bringing books into countries like Afghanistan and Pakistan and places in Africa where young women and girls don't have the opportunities to be educated and to learn. So they have had an extraordinary growth rate. Again, they're global, more than $40 million, and that's just in under 15 years. So pretty amazing organization with an incredible track record. And Erin's going to talk a lot about how they thought about leadership and culture as this organization grew and expanded. Vincent, on the other hand, runs a very different kind of organization based in San Francisco, Chinese for Affirmative Action, where he's the CEO. And they are a grassroots community organizing organization that not only does community organizing and works with all kinds of diverse social justice groups, but they're really working on building movements for equity and social justice and equality. And they were featured in a book that I just wrote for the Levi Strauss Foundation called Pioneers in Justice. So they were part of this Pioneers in Justice program that really invested in helping these leaders transform legacy social justice organizations. So Vincent has a lot that he's going to share today about that journey and what it means to be a leader of a legacy organization trying to transform it and update it by using social media, by thinking about how you change the culture, by thinking about becoming more networked and building social movements to expand impact. So really excited to have them both here. Let's see who else is in the room today. So if we could get the poll up. So here is the instructions. You either text a code to 22333 on your cell phone, or you can go to the website if you've got an iPad or a laptop, and it should show up there as well. So that's anything else I need to say by way of explanation on the technology? Good. They told me I just needed to talk. I didn't need to run the system. Thank goodness. I am a Gen Xer, not a digital native, so technology is not my strong suit. Okay, so let's see if we can get some of the questions up here. Okay, so let's just start with the role in your organization. So if you're the executive director or top leader, text 507-433. If you're a senior leader, part of what we would call the C-suite, part of the executive team. If you're another staff member of the organization, or if you're a board member. So we can start to see the results coming up here, and we'll give it just a minute. So yes, great question, because that was one of my questions too. Is like, what if we're not on technology? Because judging by the numbers up there, not everybody has had a chance to text this in. So in addition to what we've got on the screen, raise your hand if you're an executive director. Okay, good. I'd say that's about 20 at least. Senior leader, part of the executive team in your organization? Yep. Other staff member in a nonprofit organization? Staff member or volunteer? Board member? Good. Terrific. Okay, so then let's go to the next question. Let's see how old the organizations are that are represented here. So again, if your organization is relatively new startup, less than 5 years old, text the top number 5 to 15 years old, 15 to 25, or more than 25. And again, I'll ask for a show of hands in just a minute. You can't see, sorry. All right, looks like, so actually this is quite interesting. It looks like so far the majority of organizations are more than 25 years old. So if your organization's more than 25 years old, raise your hand. Yeah, I'd say that's at least half the room, right? Okay, 15 to 25 years old? Yep. 5 to 15 years old? And less than 5. Okay, a couple newbies, welcome. Welcome to the club. It's a great group to be a part of. All right. Next question. So this is around, this is also a little bit about stage of organization, but how would you describe your organization? You know, early stage, mezzanine, scaling, mature, nimble, aging. I'm not sure anybody wants to cop to that. We'll see. Maybe we should have called that like seasoned and wise. You can be nimble and aging. Yes, this one's like probably not one of the best design survey questions, but it was just meant to be a sample. So let's just go on since this is, well, it's actually interesting. Quite a few are either mature or scaling. So that seems to be the majority here. Great. So interesting conversations about, well, both, I think, because Erin's going to speak a lot to the scaling question, and Vincent's going to talk about the how do you take a mature organization and make it nimble again and scale your impact by not just growing your organization, but growing your networks and your movements. Okay, so let's go to the next question. So this is around budget size. Let's see how big your organizations are. You know, and you guys have probably seen the data on this. We mentioned it in Forces for Good too, but something like 90% of the nonprofit sector operates on less than $5 million in budget. So we have a really long tail in our sector, lots of small grassroots local organizations. In fact, Vincent's organization is at about $2 million, is probably more representative of the sector than Room to Read, which is really in the upper, like literally like the 1% of the sector in terms of size and scale. So, okay, so we actually have quite a few larger nonprofits. That's actually surprising, more than 10 million, because that is disproportionately representative, I would say, in terms of how many people are in the room. 1 to 2 million seems to be the largest category, and then 2 to 5 million. It's actually relatively well distributed. Terrific. Okay, good. Let's go on to the next. And I believe this is the last question. So this is really around your kinds of activities, providing services and programs, providing technical assistance, doing advocacy work, movement, and network building work. So go ahead and text. And this is also challenging because, you know, if any of you have read Forces for Good, one of our key theses was that you can actually do more than one of these. So having to choose one is probably hard, but just pick what's your primary area of focus. So lots of service organizations. I'm curious, just raise your hand if you guys do more than one of these categories as an organization. Okay, so that's about a third of the room. Pardon? What if you're not in those categories? What do you do? How would you describe your primary activities? Maybe it's advocacy in a broad sense, maybe not just policy advocacy, but okay, trying to change the economy. Okay. Raise your hand if you're in an other category that's not represented up here. Anyone else? Okay. Couple folks. Good, well you guys are sitting next to each other. Do you work for the same organization? You're together, okay. Just bear with us, we'll try and make it relevant. Good. Good, okay, well then we're gonna, so now that we have a little bit of an idea as to who's in the room, we're going to move on, and I'm gonna just start with a couple of framing remarks around leadership and culture. This is, an interesting topic. So the other thing I wanted to mention as we jump into the conversation is Levi Strauss provided copies of this book for everybody here. So there are you should have gotten a copy when you came in. If you didn't, they'll have them on the back table. And just in case there weren't enough, I brought about 100. We will give you a URL at the end. So if you want to download it and share with your staff, your boards, other teams. Again, this is just an opportunity to capture the stories of a number of social justice leaders, all working in the Bay Area, who are really working on transforming their organizations. And a lot of the story is about leadership and culture. So we felt like it was really relevant to the conversation today. If you go to the next slide, one of the frameworks that we use in this book is sort of looking at this interconnection of these different layers of systems that we're working on changing. So especially with these legacy organizations, these leaders are all Generation X leaders, all of them leaders of color who've inherited organizations that are more than 40 years old. So organizations that maybe would have been in that aging bucket, becoming a little more bureaucratic, working in older ways, a little bit resistant to change. And what they've done is they've taken them and they've really worked to transform these organizations and bring them into the new century, what they call social justice 2.0. And the way we looked at it is we looked at the role of the leader and kind of spearheading this change, the role of changing organizations, helping them become updated, building networks, and then building movement. So expanding the impact of the organization beyond just the organization, but into these networks and movements that they're working through. And the two forces helping drive this change, social media on the one hand in terms of its ability to connect and break down silos and reach out and engage others in our work, but also collaboration. So not just the technology aspect, but the ability to partner and sort of think outside one's own organizational boundaries. So that's kind of a key framework I wanted to share right at the beginning by way of framing the conversation we're going to have here today. And then the other framework that we put up here, this is one that the Sobrato team developed, Mara developed, after we had a conversation on the phone the other day, and we had a really rich hour-long conversation about these topics by way of preparing for the panel this morning. And she put this down on paper and synthesized it, and I said, wow, that's really great, because we had this wide-ranging conversation, and she managed to turn it into a framework that looks at different aspects of leadership, right? So character aspects that have to do with values and judgment and reflection, the skills aspects that have to do with change management, influencing, strategic thinking, and so on. Behaviors, the importance of kind of walking the talk, right? And modeling leadership for others in your organizations. And then the self-awareness, and awareness of one's context as well, the ability to think not just in terms of how am I leading my organization, but how am I leading in a larger field or a network or even a movement. So to think in the bigger systems level. So just wanted to put that up there by way of framing the conversation we're going to have today. And I think, I think what I would say, and then I'm going to invite Erin and Vincent up here, is that, there's a famous Peter Drucker quote that culture eats strategy for lunch. And I've spent a lot of time as a strategist in the nonprofit sector, and over the last 20 years, what I've really come to realize is two of the most important variables in whether an organization succeeds or not are the leadership and the culture. And in some ways, leadership's a little bit easier to get at. We can talk about it. There's been hundreds of books written about it and so on. Culture, it's almost like the water we swim in, right? It sometimes feels like it's hard to describe, but what's great is Erin and Vincent are going to give you some really concrete, tangible ways to think about how you manage and lead culture in your organizations. But I would say that, an organization can have a great strategy. If it doesn't have the right culture and the right behaviors and it's not aligned around the strategy, it's not going to happen. And if there's not great leadership in that organization, whether that's coming from the CEO or the senior team or the board level or ideally both, it's not going to happen, right? So these are really critical building blocks, which is why I think it's very appropriate that Sobrato's chosen to kind of end on these important two themes. Because they resonate and cut across many of the other building blocks that have been part of this series. So Erin, Vincent, why don't you guys come on up to the stage? Let's give them a warm welcome. First of all, anything else you guys want to say by way of background or introduction?
No, I'm learning things already, so that was great.
Well, I think if we make it anything like our phone conversation the other day, it's going to be hopefully very, very rich and interesting. So I would just encourage people to be thinking of your own questions too. So we're going to start out with a couple questions around leadership, and then we're going to take another poll, give you guys a chance to ask some questions, and we're going to pivot and talk about culture for the second half of the session. So, leadership, what does that mean to you guys? And why does it matter? I mean, I said a little bit about why, in my observation, it matters, but I would love to hear you reflect on why this is an important topic.
Well, I think leadership has always mattered, and I think maybe it matters more than ever. It's not a surprise that we're living in a time period of tremendous change. And so I think in addition to everything else, leadership has to manage change, it has to navigate change. I think the way we oftentimes understand our organizations is as a unit, and we think about the internal changes that we're trying to manage. But I think probably more than ever, our organizations in the nonprofit sector have to start looking more outward and to see how the world is changing and to understand how we fit in. And so I think, leadership, those building blocks were great, and I think this diagram is terrific too. That strong leadership, effective leadership is, it's necessary. It's certainly not sufficient on its own, but probably as much as ever, leadership really matters.
Absolutely, and I think one of the challenges is in finding great leadership and being a leader is you're working in two different areas, I think, at the same time, and they have to be cohesive and coherent. You've got a lot of strategy, a lot of vision, a lot of being able to be results driven and define and motivate, it's towards a goal. And then there's a whole other piece of it, which is the charisma, it's the emotion, it's what inspires people, it's what, why people want to follow great leaders, right? And I think the balance is trying to be authentic and be, your true north of being able to act, set the strategy and act to support it in a way that really motivates people. And I think oftentimes some people are better at one or the other, but both of them are so key, being able to set that strategy and vision and being able to motivate and inspire and, be the leader that people want to get behind.
So you've both, Erin, you came out of the private sector initially, and Ben, I don't know if you actually worked directly in government, but I know you worked with the Clinton Global Foundation and worked in international development, so sort of the global NGO space. How would you define leadership in the nonprofit sector as being different, or is it different than in the private sector or in government?
I mean, from my experience, it's actually, it's not that different except on one critical front from my own experience. I think a lot of things, as I was just saying, for a for-profit or nonprofit, any organizational body, I mean, it can just be a community group that is a volunteers that are working together that, to a very formal organization, to a, for-profit driven company. All of those, leadership, I think, shows up in, great leadership shows up very much in the same way. I would say that if you are on the nonprofit side, the thing that I think is different is because it's mission driven and there's so much passion involved with the why people are involved. From my experience, requires a different level of emotional kind of connection and self-awareness and participation from the leader that, and leaders, I mean, broadly, not just one person, but whoever's a leadership team of that movement, of that organization. I do think it taps into that side much more. And I'd say your tools for building, for motivating people are also different, and there's much more consensus driven. You have to get people to participate in ways that are not obviously about stock options or a paycheck, but are about feeling that this is the right direction, that we all want to move in together. That there's there's a certain level of participation and buy-in, which I think is much more intensive in the nonprofit space for very obvious reasons. That the people are volunteering their time or they're taking other pay cuts from doing other things because they care so deeply and so passionately about the issue.
Right. Yeah. Ben, would you add to?
I think that the practice of leadership is probably very similar across the board, but the content and the substance of it has to be different. I think nonprofit leaders have to be the conscience for the community. I think the private sector is designed for a very particular thing, which is to create wealth. I think government is designed to be representative, hopefully to be representative in a way that includes people who have been disenfranchised. But the nonprofit sector, if there is a sector that can provide some type of moral or ethical leadership, that's got to come from the nonprofit sector, and by extension, that has to come from the leaders. So I think that when you see, government officials screw up, or you see private sector people, say this or that, it's a different. There are different ramifications, and when the sector that is trying to make change good, right, that is trying to imbue a sense of what's right and wrong, I think we have to hold ourselves to a different type of standard. But the actual practice, these skills, these behaviors, the awareness, those are certainly transferable.
And it's interesting, Heather, one thing on this I would say that at least in the 14 years that Room to Read has been around is I actually think this question is almost becoming irrelevant, because more and more for-profit companies are now at least part of a part of Room to Read's network are saying, hey, we want to be able to motivate our employees like you guys do, because everyone who's joining us and this next generation wants their values to be part of their workplace, right? And you have companies out there like Google saying, hey, we're doing this for the good of the world. I mean, how do you define profit driven? You have Amazon, sort of selling at costs that don't actually earn them profit, but they think that they're, creating a new world to live in, right? They're changing the world, but in a for-profit way. So you have a lot of for-profit companies trying to understand how to be mission driven in some ways, and you have, then you have organizations like Room to Read, where we've largely come up being known sort of as a nonprofit that operates like a for-profit, efficient, results driven, all of these terms that you use. So that merging, I think, is actually an interesting place that we as a society are in.
Yeah. No, I would totally agree with you guys. And in fact, that's partly why I sort of asked the question, because I do think the sector boundaries are blurring, right? I'm on the board of a group called Fuse Corps, and there's a lot of conversation around these tri-sector athletes. How do we take the, entrepreneurialism of the private sector and bring it into government to infuse innovation into government, right? And as you said, I think you see a lot, especially around here, this whole kind of theme of compassionate management, Jeff Weiner and LinkedIn and a number of these companies, Salesforce, the 1% giving back. I think you're seeing a whole trend towards, wow, we need to have purpose and passion and meaning be part of our workplace culture, even if we're for profit. Now, what I want to work on is how do we get the Facebook IPO for nonprofit leaders? If you can solve that, that would be that would
it's
be
in
great.
Karma points, so
Karma points, exactly. Yeah.
One of the things that all three sectors do have in common, though, is that they are based around organizations. And I think that what's happening with technology and in particular social media, it's becoming easier and easier for people to organize without organizations. And so, like how many people here have their own Twitter account, or how many people here have their own, Facebook profile? That, the ability of individual actors to be able to affect change or to volunteer, with their own groups of friends is dramatically shifting, I think, what the role of private sector, government, and nonprofit can be, right? And that, again, I think calls for a new type of leadership, or it calls for us to understand how we show up as leaders in different ways.
And culturally, I'd say that too. Globally, you have almost more social media happening outside of some of the more developed countries that we typically think of that is driving media. And you think of social media broaden it, that is completely changing the face of the world. And a lot of these government, country boundaries are breaking down as well.
Yeah, actually. And if you look at the role of social media, even just some of the political revolutions in the last few years in the Middle East and whatnot, in Egypt, and it is pretty amazing. I mean, that was Clay Shirky wrote that book, right? And he talks about organizing without organizations, but I think that's definitely true. So what are the implications of that then for your roles as leaders? And this is going off some of the scripted questions, but I'm curious to hear how you think about leadership beyond just organizational boundaries. What does it mean then to be a leader in a networked world where people can organize and can look up to you and can choose to be like, I want to affiliate with the Room to Read movement, or I want to affiliate with Chinese for Affirmative Action, even though I might not know the name of your organization, I'm affiliated with the cause. What are the leadership implications of that?
Yeah, well, I think it actually, I think the challenge in again, defining how we're looking at leadership, I think for me, the important thing is then to define it by the movement and by having more leaders. Because I think if you focus too much, a little bit of the social entrepreneur space, from my experience, is too much focused on individuals and kind of glorifying, individuals as opposed to the issues, the change, the movement. And I think there's a risk there. And so I do think, there's pros and cons of this when you look at it. Then, I think there is a lot of what we spend our time globally for Room to Read is creating this movement around the importance of international education. And we have these great volunteer chapters that are now operate in over 52 cities and 16 different countries. We actually raise more than half our money outside of the US, which is phenomenal as a small nonprofit because of these great, local groups that start from Paris to Sydney to, wherever that care about this issue. Right. And it's sort of opened up a lot of platforms for leaders and other communities to step up and say, we care about this and we want to help be a part of creating this change. we have to also caution ourselves not to be focused too much on what does that mean if you are the leader, that someone's following somebody on Twitter or someone's following a person, and not trying to glorify that this person is doing it by themselves. And I think there's a risk of that with social media as well, as it's very easy to get caught up on someone doing it as opposed to a group of committed individuals. And so that's something we talk about a lot, and I think I think people struggle with that, with all the tools that we have out there, is not glorifying the individual.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Yeah.
And there used to be this sort of mantra in a lot of movement work, unity, struggle, unity, right? And I think we're really moving to a time where it's much more about clarity, struggle, clarity, meaning that we have the ability to develop our own theories of change and our own strategy for how we think the world can get better. But it's probably more important, in my view, for us to have some shared collective theory of change, and then to understand which part of that theory our organizations are going to hold ourselves accountable to. Right. It does not mean that there'll be one grand unifying theory, but it means that we need to understand, okay, let's get clear, you're doing this, I'm doing that, and we can live with this, right? And I think that more so than ever, part of being an effective leader is, on the one hand, being clear about that, and then second, being accountable to that. And then I think the other dimension in terms of what that really means, I think that we have to show up as human beings, which sounds sort of silly, but that, that with all this new technology, it allows us to be more human in more outward-facing ways, right? And so the idea that the leader of an organization can just sort of sit back within, the four walls of their office and not really get out and understand. And, I think there's this potential for us in our sector really to humanize the work that can be transformative.
Yeah. Well, and you guys sort of touched on a little bit of what, I talk about the paradox of leadership, especially in this 2.0 way. It's not just about the heroic individual, but at the same time, social media not only enables you, but almost compels you to have a personal story and to share your personal story as a way of connecting people in, right? So I know, Ven, in the Pioneers in Justice program, that's been one of the big themes for you all as leaders. I mean, many of these Gen X leaders have been actually quite self-effacing and haven't wanted to build a movement around the charismatic individual like many of the social movements of the 1960s. And so they've deliberately tried to make it about the work or the network. But I think, interestingly, you guys have had to learn how to do what you just said, which is share your story and share your voice in an authentic and humble way, but not to just completely hold back either, right?
Right. I mean, I think that the power of personalities is very much a part of American culture, and it's difficult to get away from that. But I also think that, similar to what really happened with a lot of the effective humanizing movements in our history, there were followers, and there were leaders, and there were lots of folks who were organizing the bus boycott. There were lots of folks who were involved in the suffragist movement. That historically, for simplicity's sake, we tend to mythologize and lift up one or two characters and individuals. I think the way that we can think about it today is that for every Twitter personality that we may know about, there are hundreds of thousands of people following and retweeting and adding their own twist to it, right? And so you can't have something go viral without a community, right?
Yeah.
And so that there really are no leaders without followers, and in many ways, those followers are also leaders. And so, it is sort of this paradox.
Yeah. What, just in terms of inspirations in your own life, are there particular leaders that you both look up to that have influenced you in terms of how you think about leadership?
I actually have to say that I am a big fan of the everyday leader. I mean, there are people that, I remember particularly when I was younger, sort of starting out, I'd read a lot of, Madeleine Albright's, one amazing story of how she became, the first female Secretary of State, right? And just things that were very inspirational as a woman, or someone connected with, international development, someone like Muhammad Yunus, who's, somebody who's an inspirational, person. So there definitely are those moments where you read and you get inspired. But I think actually the more that I've, probably matured as I've grown older and have the gray hair of what Room to Read is, building Room to Read creates, is I've learned much more to be inspired by the people that I now meet, every day, that are, the heroes that are, running some of the chapters, that are doing an amazing amount of work for Room to Read as a volunteer. I'm like, I don't think I would actually volunteer that hard for us, and are inspired by them, or the people that I meet, that are in the communities that we are in. I meet women all the time that never made it past third grade, that, fight to keep their daughters in school, to be able to change, society's views, and to be able to be, to be a stand-up and be a leader and want to create the change, so that their daughters and, sons both have something different world to live in. And, people like that just deeply inspire me, because I think, the road that's, to walk behind them is to walk behind amazing leaders.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. Yeah.
I would echo that 100%. Just to give maybe another example, our organization takes a very broad and we think correct view of civil rights. That it's not just about race, but it's also about gender. It's also about class. It's also about queer acceptance and inclusion. And so we were very involved in the campaign against Proposition 8, the ballot initiative that essentially tried to ban marriage equality in California. And there was one inspiring organizational leader, Kate Kendall, from the National Center for Lesbian Rights. And I thought she was brilliant in terms of not being clever about ideas, but being thoughtful and persistent. And I think again in our country we tend to value the clever and sometimes like the gimmicky stuff, and but she was just so not gimmicky, right? And there was this understanding that we may not win, but we're going to do this the right way. And you see how that's now unfolded. And 10 years later, close to 20 states across the country now have marriage equality, when we were, when that seemed almost impossible just years before. And I think that's sort of the power that their organization is a large organization, but relative to the impact that they're having, it's astonishing, because many of the things that they do are able to be picked up by other people. Folks understand the powerful lessons, and they're distributed in ways. And so, just working with her and watching her lead has been great for me.
Yeah, people look for authentic leadership, I think, more and more. And I think we all know when we don't see it, and when we do see it, I think people I think tend to be much more committed and longer term committed when they feel that it's really authentic and not a gimmick.
I want to pivot and talk just a little bit about leadership in your organizations. For leaders here in the room today, how do you all think about building strong teams, and how do you think about, there's several layers to this, right? There's kind of the senior leadership level in your organization, then there's the how do you do leadership development with your staff, which I know is actually something you've both thought a lot about, and then there's this whole piece around the board, right? So maybe we could just touch on each of those just briefly, but how do you think about, let's start with just your senior team, and then also kind of bringing up next generation leaders like in your staff, and how intentional are you about leadership development?
Yeah, I think the hard part, the honest truth, as we all know, as leaders that are working deeply on issues that we care about in our organizations, the hardest part for a nonprofit is to actually be able to invest in resources in your own organization, right? I mean, it's, we can go through all the obvious reasons around funding and, challenges of being able to show results that drive that. But the reality is, that we've learned the very hard way at Room to Read is that we started to implode because we didn't have enough investment in ourselves at certain points. And we had been so externally focused on our results and on everything we needed to do to demonstrate the impact we were having, that we started to actually not be able to build a strong enough base internally that could continue to scale and grow the organization. And so a few years ago, we had to really slow down to a certain extent and put into place more, more thoughtful, strategic investments in our human resources and our capacity building and our and bringing on and creating more leadership roles, and going through that and explaining that to our investors, to our board, to people that were used to us running very thin in ourselves and very sort of externally focused. It was a hard conversation to have. It still surprises me how much people think that organizations don't need sort of that strong, healthy infrastructure and people management, and yet think that they can do such great work externally, right? So that's still a very hard conversation to have. So we've gone out and we've built a much more sophisticated, sort of base of capacity building tools, and invested in growing people, and have many more people rising in the organization, staying with us longer and seeing their careers with us. It's still a struggle. We're doing it across different cultures, different languages. I mean, this is not, people are like, do you use online training? I'm like, they don't really train online in the Lao language or Khmer in Cambodia, right? So these are difficult, really difficult things to do. But we're very committed to doing it, and are spending more, putting our money where we need to put it now. In terms of sort of top leaders, I think that's also a very, I hire, it's all about hiring, as we know. It's not like any other business. It's all about getting the great talent in the door, and being able to attract and retain and retain them. And I think for that, we hire much more on organizational culture, kind of where does this dovetail into culture?
Yeah.
Much more on culture than on skills. It's very generally fairly easy to find people with the right kinds of skills. It's very hard to find people that will actually stick with your organization. And most really strong, healthy cultures spit people out really fast that don't fit in their culture. I mean, I remember one person that we let go of in like 4 days. We were just like, you are not, we made a mistake. We're sorry, but this is totally not going to work, right? And you can find it really quickly if you've got a good culture, and and when you also find the right fit, you kind of know it, and
Right.
you have to jump in. And every consultant that we've had has been like, you guys need to hire faster. That's part of your problem. And I'm like, you know what? I don't believe that. We have an intensive process. We have to meet a lot of people in the organization. You have to go through several rounds where you're talking about core issues and how you would show up at work and what you would do in your first 90 days and tackle a big problem that role is going to face, as well as meet a lot of people. And those things matter to us because when we get great people, they're really good and they fit in our culture and they stay a long time.
Yeah, great. What about you, Vin?
Well, I think that there are different lines of thinking about whether you can teach leadership, but we know that it can be learned. And so one thing we try and do in our organization is to emphasize the practice, essentially to create safety nets and handrails and encourage people to lead, but always know that there's a way to shore them up or to catch people if they fall, right? I think that at the end of the day, we can send folks to workshops and to retreats and to sessions, but people got to get out there and do what they do and lead. And so I think that the culture that comes out of that is an attentive culture, right? That's paying very, very close attention and being very mindful very quickly about how people are doing and how they're feeling with the responsibilities of leadership.
Yeah. And I know we could spend an entire hour talking about board governance, in fact, probably an entire day. It's such a big topic. But in just a couple, sentences, can you give us your sort of top line thoughts on how you think about the board as part of the leadership of the organization?
This is a tough one because I think there's also a lot written about this, right? And I probably have the school of thought that having the board function like a department within the organization, with the board chair being at the head of the department, where they have room to make a lot of decisions, but you need to have a strong leader of that board. I think that when boards aren't working, the options are you can change the board members, or you can change the attitude of the board chair and the board executive director, right? I think part of it is because board members are interacting with the organization at a different level of frequency. And so board meetings are only happening every 3 months or 2 months or 4 months. It's just hard, right? And so, I think that, usually we're getting folks who are very, very busy and committed to a whole bunch of different things, right? And so, in my experience, the attitude has to, the change and has to come from, board chair and the CEO together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's challenging. I mean, Room to Read's board is largely some of our largest investors. So by nature of the relationship, it's a complex one, right? They're
It's like
investing.
venture capital model.
Yeah,
a little
it's
bit,
very
right?
much like the venture capital model. And so they're there. They have a seat at the table for one particular reason. And the way they show up, though, you want them to show up in a different way, right? You want them to show up really caring about the mission, understanding it deeply, understanding the complexities of the challenges that you're faced with, not just looking at it, purely as as why did they invest in this and what are they trying to, what's the return on that investment, right? So it's a conversation, and it's a, kind of embracing them and helping them to get up to speed and educate them a lot. That is part of what I see my job, so they understand the complexities. And I think that the other key piece is having board members really understand that they're there to play a couple of key functions, but to really talk about that in the boardroom. They're there obviously for governance and for oversight, checks and balances, which is an important job, but they're not there to do the job of management. And I think that's a hard thing, because oftentimes board members are used to being in a CEO role or in a having run an operation, and so they kind of immediately like, I know how to do that, and it's like, well, that may or may not be the case, but actually this is not a time when you're supposed to be doing that, right? There's a management team that you need to be guiding and advising and working with them, but the boundary between doing it And stepping back and having a board seat, I think, is a very important one to talk about, so that you are clear that this is the management running the organization, the board is helping to advise and guide it.
Right, and I think that just making that distinction will get you a long way. That there's the work that the board does collectively, which is governance, oversight, passing the budget, hiring the executive director, and then there's the work they can do as individuals, going out and being a champion for the organization, making contacts for the organization, fundraising, right? And just separating out, okay, telling someone these are the things we do together as a group, and then these are the things that you all do as individuals, and it looks different. And for someone, maybe it's fundraising. And for someone, it's hosting, a dinner for the staff. I mean, it's just gonna, and so that the individuals that show up on the board can show up as individuals too, but being real clear that the meetings and some of the formal responsibilities are about collective action.
So last question on this, and then we're going to pivot to culture. And I want to get you guys engaged again in just doing a quick poll around culture. I'm tempted to digress and ask about boards, but we won't go there because again, it could be a whole conversation. Gen Xers, we're all Generation X, right? We've been described as the sandwich generation because we're caught between the baby boomers and the millennials. And I think there's a whole interesting conversation happening in the sector around intergenerational leadership transfer. And I know this has been one of the really big themes, Vin, and the pioneers work that you've been doing, where legacy, civil rights and social justice organizations often have boomer boards and then a lot of millennial staff, right? You've been doing work with like Dreamers and youth organizing, and you've got 21-year-olds tweeting and building networks around your organization, and sort of, and I don't know how much this is a theme in Room to Read, Erin, but I'm just curious if you have any reflections on that sort of intergenerational leadership styles. I mean, I myself am working on a team building a leadership network with a baby boomer partner, and then a millennial staff backbone organization guy, and the three of us represent all three generations, and we talk about it a lot. It's just an interesting, I think, figuring out how we navigate this. And it's actually kind of a segue to the culture conversation too, but any quick thoughts on that?
Well, I'm very hopeful. I think that it's kind of like seeing grandparents with grandkids, right? There's just like a lot of the good without a lot of the bad, right? Like they sort of strip away some of the tensions, and and people can connect in a fashion that's very very loving, and so when you see, at least in our work, whether we call them millennials or digital natives, the way they are moved by the work of folks who were very active in the civil rights movements of the 60s, the baby boomer generation, like there's a lot of potential there. I think this is the difficult part is the technology, that they're just not using the same technology, and so it's figuring out, well, it's like teaching, in my case, my parents to use Skype, right? I mean, it's like these things but once they learn, right, then they can't get off of it, and then there's a different problem, right? But you see these things where it's like the tools may be difficult, but hopefully there is on the one hand, this tremendous respect for people who've lived a life,
right?
And then at the same time, a tremendous sense of hope and optimism for people who are just beginning to live their lives, right?
Yeah.
And I think if we can figure out how to really bring those together, we have, we can do a lot.
Yeah, I think about it I'm a little bit divided on this one. I haven't made up my mind yet. I think in our operations where we're working in the countries we're working in to raise money and to raise awareness about the cause, I see a lot of what you're saying where people are coming together, and they're great ways to do that. In the countries where we are a service provider and we're helping to invest in developing countries in very rural circumstances, there's not a lot of technology, obviously. First of all, most 70% of the government public schools that we work in are not even near electrical grid, much less have computer labs in them, right? So it's still very much a bricks and mortar delivery of education, and I think one of the challenges that we see is there's a certain level of impatience, in the kind of millennial generation of like, so why don't we just go do this? Like, just tell me where my money went and like give me the GPS coordinates. I'll zoom in on the school and I'll like see change happen like from my laptop. And I'm like, wow, you have no idea. I mean, some of the schools we work in, it can take a day to hike in Nepal to get to it.
Right.
And that change is a process of working with the community, and community engagement is probably one of the most important things that we do that's never talked about, right? And it's about getting people invested in the schools and getting parents and the government government and the teachers in alignment with working on, something. I mean, education doesn't happen quickly, right? I mean, we're talking 10 years, 12 years before you start to see some of the change really deeply rooted in a government school system that we're, sort of being a catalyst for. And so it's very hard to articulate and keep people, feeling good and kind of something to, put up on Facebook about the change they created if I tell you it takes 10 years for you to really see that.
Right.
So that's where I think there's somewhat of a different expectation that it does worry me, that all these problems are so easy to solve. Just put a well in Africa. Well, what happens, 6 weeks later when that well breaks down and no one's there to fix it? And, yes, technology and things can help to bring a light to that, and I know we're solving these problems, but there's a reason why civil society has existed for a long time, which is to keep, again, as you were saying, to be that kind of viewpoint of saying, hey, these issues matter, they take a long time, we have to be part of the integrity, and really thinking through how to solve these issues are difficult.
Yeah, I mean, humility is important. I mean, I think that there's always going to be one aspect where it's like, oh, kids these days, they don't appreciate this. We used to have to use fax machines, and so there's always going to be like one element of just kind of like a sense of entitlement of just being able to start life where you're starting it. I think what's maybe different now is that the incredible transfer of wealth to a smaller number of people who are still younger or youngish. That historically would have taken decades to accumulate. And I think if they're not having the humility to really understand systemic problems, to understand complexity of problems, we can really go awry.
Yep. So I want to actually just take a couple minutes to get just a few quick comments, questions on leadership, and then we're going to pivot and talk a little bit about culture. But rather than sort of waiting till the very end to get your questions, would love to just get a couple voices in here. So if you have a quick question on the leadership topic or a quick observation, and I would encourage you to be succinct, please raise your hand. Anyone? Yeah, okay, a couple hands up over here. Great, thanks. Yes?
Just specific, I guess, for Vincent. Vincent, you made a comment that resonated with me about how we're talking about leadership across for-profit and nonprofit, and I see there's quite a big divide in terms of the standards we're held to versus the for-profit world. And you mentioned something that the for-profit leader we need to be the conscience for the society. I disagree with that. And maybe I just heard it wrong, but I was wondering if you could comment more what you meant by that, because
Sure.
I feel like if the for-profit world leadership base is based on this, and Posner and Kuz's, the Model Leadership Challenge, then there should be an equivalent leadership across the board, and that would help us to work together to get more done in the world. So maybe you could comment more on that.
Maybe I could refine it by saying that the nonprofit sectors may be the most explicitly charged in terms of how we set up our tax structure for being the conscience of society. That all of us, if we're working for nonprofits, do not have private shareholders, that we're accountable to the public in a very broad way. And so to the extent that values in a more pure form, obviously nothing's pure, but if it's going to come from any of the three, in my view, it would come from the nonprofit sector.
Great. Good, thanks. I saw a couple other hands here. Let's take two more questions here and see maybe if there's someone on this side of the room, we can get one more in. Yes.
Lisa Van Dusen.
Lisa, yes.
Lisa Van Dusen from S. Is that on?
Lisa, yes. I think it's on. Okay, it's on.
Lisa Van Dusen from SV2. And this is for you, Erin. Just your comment about the kind of time horizon for change. And I think it's true in many contexts, but I think it's exaggerated or on the extreme end in yours. What do you do about that?
Well, I think one of the things that we've been able to do is make people understand help educate people on understanding the bigger issue while making it feel tangible at the same time. So we do actually engage in a lot of come in and see the work, first of all, is a great, opportunity. Not everyone obviously can travel to where we're working, but even trying to then bring that back home through videos, through reports on school. So you see change incrementally over time, and kind of breaking it down into building blocks where you can see the long-term issue you're addressing, but you feel like there's some tangible element of it. I think one of the big challenges working internationally is, how do you make it feel tangible? So we spend a lot of time making people feel connected to the areas that we work in. And that is, again, where actually technology is a phenomenal tool, right? So you can have people, I always say it's the head and the heart that makes these decisions, right? So it's helping people understand the numbers, the big issues, the challenges that you're facing and how we're addressing that, but it also makes them feel connected, incrementally to seeing, a child learning to read, or to seeing a girl story, that is as amazing. Her telling it on a video and us translating it makes you feel like, even though it's going to take her 7 years to graduate from secondary school, she's heading in the right direction. And so kind of making that one-to-one connection.
Great. And there was one more question down here. So, yeah.
Three of us here represent two organizations that have been in existence for a long time, but have restarted themselves, in a sense. We have very small, like zero budgets. And so the notion of staff and board division and the board, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you got started, because I think that's where we are.
Well, and actually, Vincent's working with a couple organizations that don't have any
Yeah.
paid staff through this amazing network. You should mention the Acre Network, because I think
Sure.
that's a great example of how all volunteer organizations can have much more impact.
No, go ahead. I think
Well, so one of the things we realized, maybe about 7, 8 years ago, is that there simply weren't going to be enough resources to do all the work that we wanted to do. And that even when we do see that there are resources, many times we're competing against our allies. And so grants that we're getting are grants that our fellow nonprofits who are trying to do the same thing in many ways are not getting. And so we began to try and rethink what resources really mean. I think part of that was to understand that the ability of people to volunteer, to participate, that we can't, in our work, we're not going to make it if we only have paid activists, right? We have to figure out how to really engage the community in new ways. But that doesn't mean that organizations don't have something to offer. And so what CAA has done is provided the backbone infrastructure now for about 7 different groups. So we're, a combination of fiscal sponsor, physical space, like Sobrato is doing here, strategic sponsor, looking for ways for groups to collaborate. I think that it is a different set of challenges, right? It's similar to what we were talking about before with the board. When you have volunteers who are there every day, it's a very different thing than volunteers who can come maybe every 2 months, right? I think what we found, though, is that in each of these different groups, there are always a core of leaders. There's always a core of people who just believe in it, and they care about the work so much that they're willing to learn the other stuff, right? And if we can help them learn that other stuff faster, or in some cases, just do that other stuff, the management, the accounting, and just let leaders who care about a particular issue or concern lead on those things, and that's what we want to try and do.
Yeah, so not every individual has to be the social entrepreneur that says, I have to start an organization, and I have to have a board, and I have to have paid staff. I mean, the beauty of the sector is it encompasses such a wide range of organizing forms, right? Including some of the small, all-volunteer type.
And I think the key is really having those conversations openly. I mean, we started else with, a lot of volunteers, a lot of our, key board members were volunteers, investors, and did a job like, accounting all at the same time, right? And then over time as you grow, and if the goal is to grow, and not saying that is, should or should not be, but as you grow, it's about also creating a learning organization that evolves. And that conversation, I think, has to be had very explicitly. We're now at this side, we actually need to hire somebody to do that job. And that means that all of us, have helped, bring this to the stage that it is. We should congratulate ourselves. We got to where we want to be. Now we can step back and create space for different kinds of people to show up. And I think if you have that conversation explicitly, I think where it goes wrong is when people feel like, hey, am I being put out to pasture, or why am I being told I don't need to do this anymore? And that's where I think, particularly at the board level, it can get sometimes a little bit of a disappointing conversation if people don't feel like their role was honored or their contribution was honored. I think it's about saying, we're all striving to do this, and that means we all have to change and learn as the organization grows, and that's a healthy, wonderful thing that we're supporting.
Yeah, if I could just say one thing, because it relates to the previous question. I think one of the things we don't talk about, and I think just looking at the list again, that leaders end up having to do, is we have to create a framework around time, right? Like what's reasonable in terms of how long something should take. Because on the one hand, we need to drive with a sense of urgency, but then on the other hand, we have to have patience, and we have to understand that meaningful change takes time. And so I think leaders end up setting expectations around time, whether it's how long it takes for a child to be able to learn to read or to catch up in reading, or in our case, to pass legislation. I mean, I've been working on getting comprehensive immigration reform for 8 years, and we're literally 2 votes away from it, and we may not get it, right? And so, I think that the issue of time and expectations from stakeholders around time is an important function of leadership too.
Great.
So let's pivot and save your questions, because we'll have some more time at the end. But I want to pivot and get to the culture conversation. Speaking of managing time, I'm aware of of how I'm doing on that, and I want to keep the conversation moving along. So let's project, if we can, just a couple more of the text questions around culture. So up here we have a question around statement of values. So we heard a little bit about the relationship between values and leadership, but values really are what make a culture. Do you have a statement of values for your organization? Can you summarize or state them? So go ahead and text your answer if you've got. Let's see kind of how this plays out. And I would also just add, while we're waiting for the responses to come in, I would add that it's sometimes not just enough to have a statement of values on the wall, but it's really about how you live those values as an organization, which we're going to talk about. So lots of yeses and some whats, okay, and a couple no's. Good. Well, that's good. That's a good start. Great. So let's go to the next question. I know the answers are still trickling in, but we got a snapshot there. Do you think leaders in your organization prioritize time for deepening their leadership skills? So this is a little bit on the leadership topic, but really, how much time do you take to invest in yourself as a leader and invest in other people in your organization? Not sure. No. I'll just talk over this as we're waiting for the numbers to come through, but the Haas Jr. Fund has done some interesting research. Linda Wood, if you guys know some of their work around leadership development and investing in leadership in the social sector. And, if you look at the private sector, private sector spends literally hundreds of millions of dollars on leadership development, right? It is considered such a critical thing to invest in. And the nonprofit sector, very, very, very little, which is why I think actually this kind of forum where we can do shared capacity building and bring people together to do leadership development is so important. Okay, so it's actually almost an equal split. Yes and no.
Some people answered both ways.
Or not sure, right? Okay. Was there one more question? Let's see if there are a few more questions on culture. Let's just do go to the next slide and see. Let's get a couple more questions on culture up there, and then we'll get into the conversation. So do you feel leaders in your organization align their actions and decisions to your values? So this goes to the point I was making about it's not just about having the value statement on the wall. It's about walking the talk. So let's see how consistent our organizations are in terms of living out the values. This is kind of about that point around authenticity of leadership too, I think, right? More and more, I think we're aware of what's authentic and what's not authentic. So if you're saying one thing and doing another, hard to have credibility as a leader. Consistently or inconsistently. That's good. Well, at least consistently seems to be winning. That's a good sign. Something to be hopeful about. Okay, and was there one more question on the culture? And do you think leaders in your organizations have a focus on developing culture? So this is one that does not get talked about much at all in the nonprofit sector. I have to say this is the first time I've been part of an explicit conversation around culture that's not in the context of like doing a strategy project with one organization, but actually talking about the importance of culture as it relates to leadership and organizational development. Somewhat. Okay. So, good. Yes. Oh, yes is catching up. Well, it looks like there's some room for improvement, but good that there is yeses and nos equally split. So let's see if our conversation can actually help direct give these folks some thoughts on culture and how you think about managing it. So I guess where we'll start is this whole, where we kind of started on the phone the other day is, culture does feel somewhat amorphous. When you're in an organization, sometimes it's just kind of like the water you swim in. It's just the way things get done, right? It's the habits, it's the behaviors, it's the values, it's the kind of organizational expression. You know, if leadership is about how you show up in the world, then I think of culture as how you show up as an organization, right? Kind of collectively. How would you guys define culture? And again, why do you think it's important to be having this conversation?
Well, I think one of the things that's really important is to talk about what is explicit and what is implicit in culture. I think there are stated, core values, and most of us, we've all read the books on management. Have your core values clear, make them not too many so people can remember them, put them on the wall, sort of. Brand them, tattoo them on your arm, whatever you need to do to make people, think about that. And so I think we generally start there with culture and at a certain point of an organization. And I would say at the beginning, the first few years, at least for us, it wasn't so clear. I mean, I think that you have to give a startup a chance to actually develop a culture. It largely comes from the beginning founding team, and then it starts to become, maybe a more solid, set of actual values. The first time we did our core values as an organization, we had 12 of them, and then the next time we did them, none of us could remember all 12 of them at any given time, so we narrowed them down to 5, And so there is sort of a process, it's an evolution, I would say. It's not, a culture should be a living thing, it's not one, point in time. But then I think there's all of the things that are, not necessarily as explicit than that also is part of your culture, which is, are you authentic and do you behave the way that you're stating you want to behave? I mean, there are many examples, and we ourselves have had to go through times where we've, analyzed this on our own way. We say we value teamwork, yet there are a couple of key people that always make the decisions. So is that, what are you living out what you are doing, right? I mean, you say we value, local diversity and respect, and wanting local ideas to bubble up, but, every time in a meeting someone brings up a crazy idea, we squash it. We say, well, that's a bad idea. These are examples that we can all think of where what you actually do reinforces more than, what's on the wall, how people learn to behave. And so if every time they innovate and they get squashed for it, then they stop innovating, right? So is innovation really a part of your culture or not? And I think we've had to, go through our own kind of growing pains of saying, what do we really value? Make it narrow enough that you can hold yourselves to them. And then it is an evolving learning thing that you have to really reinforce. You have to reinforce it through structure and processes. You have to reinforce it through behaviors, and fun ways that you continue to show up and interact with, as a team. So I think there's many ways that you have to reinforce it, but you have to find ways to make them come alive.
Yep, and I want to come back to this how you make it explicit question, but Ven, let's hear your response to sort of how you would define or how you think about culture and why it matters.
Yeah, I mean, it does start with the values. We try and break it up. There's, what we stand for, and then there's like how we be the change we want to see, right? And so, the first set are very aspirational, and no one's perfect, and you never really get there, but they're aspirational, and they're a way to point us in the right direction. And how we be the change you want to be is a little bit more practical, and and it's practical in the sense that it's not pie in the sky. Like we're an organization, and there are policies, and there's got to be accountability, but that doesn't mean that we can't name the way we want to be the change that we want to see. So I think those things shape culture. I think what happens is then, from there, you can get creative. What are the stories we tell? What are the images we have? What is the way our office is set up? What do our HR policies look like? How do we extend ourselves to issues that aren't our focus area, right? And so I think that you can, once we, or the way we make the culture alive, doesn't have to be amorphous. In fact, we're doing it every day, right? And we're doing it every day in the way we show up in meetings like this or in society. And we can name culture oftentimes at the societal level, and the process is very similar for organizations.